Hello everyone! I am Alice of KHR Arts and Cloud Orchid Publishing, and today we are going to be reviewing The Concubines Daughter, and forgive me if I pronounce this wrong, by Pai Kit Fai. I'm gonna put that down here for y'all so that y'all can see it. And again, I apologize if I pronounce that wrong. It is a Chinese name, and I will be honest that I personally don't really know how to pronounce Chinese words, but it is something that I very much want to learn in the future. Mandarin is one of the languages that I very much want to learn in the future. So, onward to the book review of The Concubines Daughter. So this story is about the main character. Her name is Li. This is her full name. In the story, it means beautiful one. And again, I'm probably not going to pronounce it right, so we're just going to call her Li. She is referred to as Li for the majority of the story, but this is her full name, and it means beautiful one. She is born to a low-level official, her father, and he has his wife, and he has a few concubines, and that was normal in Chinese society, where rather than being polygamist where they have multiple wives, they have one wife and they have multiple concubines as kind of like they're a step down from being a wife. So the wife is still the wife and is revered and all of that. It's a whole social hierarchy, but that is basically the breakdown for the familial ties for the sake of this story. Li was specifically born to one of the concubines and not the wife. And even more specifically, the concubine that she was born to was seen as a fox spirit. And so this is kind of the Chinese equivalent of the European witch. She was believed to possess magical powers that she used to seduce the father, and that he eventually took her on as a concubine and took her into his household and paid so much more attention to her than the other concubines and the wife, which made them all very jealous, and all of this ensued. And so when this concubine gave birth to Li, the father was very much wanting a son, which is a very common thing during this time period in China, and I mean, honestly, in any country. And he was very upset when he learned that Li was in fact a girl and not a boy, and the poor mother was just treated so poorly by the wife and the other concubines, and then afterward by the father for having a girl instead of a son, that she ended up unaliving herself in a very tragic and horrific way. And so Li was raised without a mother, and she was mistreated by everyone because she was seen as also being a fox spirit because of what her mother had been accused of, and the fact that she was born a very beautiful child, and the fact that she also was very precocious, that she had a lot of qualities about her that were seen as not feminine and not appropriate. She loved running around and playing outside. She loved doing a lot of things that were very tomboyish, and so all of that just attributed to her being a fox spirit. Now, back in Chinese society during this time period, women were unfortunately not seen as people. They were seen as property, and as such, they had to be useful. And being useful typically meant either having them married off to family that would bring more prestige and wealth to the married family, or sending them off to the emperor's palace, whether it's to work at the palace as some sort of maid or to become one of the emperor's concubines. So this was the ultimate goal for Li via her father. This wasn't Li's personal goal. This was her father's personal goal. He wanted to make her useful. And so he started having her trained to become, whether it was going to be married off to be a wife or sent off to be a concubine to the emperor. And the thing that they did to make her more valuable was they bound her feet. This was during a time period when foot binding was still a thing in China. It is a horrific thing to do to someone's foot. Please don't Google it. It is disgusting to look at. Basically what they do is they take the foot and they smash the bones so that the toes get curled under the foot, and it's like half the size of what a foot is supposed to be, and all the toes are curled under, and they can no longer walk. They're essentially disabled, and a lot of times because of the extreme way that the bones are like essentially like bent in half, They develop infections that plague them for their whole lives. So they have these, rotting feet, and a lot of them lose their feet and they just become stumps. It's awful and gross. And Li understood at a very early age that this was very symbolic of her being property and her being chained down. And this was everything that she was against, was that she wanted to be free to live her own life, to be able to pursue the things that she wanted to pursue. And she knew in order to be able to do that, she could not let them bind her feet. So she played on them believing that she was a fox spirit, and she was very difficult whenever they would daily do the bindings on her feet and flailing around and throwing a fit and just being a nuisance, so that they weren't really paying attention when they were trying to bind her feet, and the bindings would be too loose. And then when they would take them off in the evening, she would make it a point that when she was expected to go to bed and everyone left her alone, she would sit there massaging her feet, basically fixing the damage that day had done to her feet and walking around and keeping the bones as straight as possible. And according to their practices, there's a very short window of time when you can do this to a person's feet to achieve what they call lotus feet. And that is the goal of the foot binding, is so that the feet are small enough to be a very specific size and fit in these very specific type of shoes that are called lotus shoes, because they have this spiritual belief that women that have these feet, these perfect feet, will, as they say, dance upon the lotus, and that they will be graced with extreme beauty and grace and femininity once they come of age into being women, if they are able to dance upon the lotus. This is the belief. And so when Li gets to the age of that she was supposed to have these perfect feet and dance upon the lotus, and that basically determines is she going to be valuable or not, much to their chagrin, her feet are deformed. There's no question of that. They are deformed, but they are not completely all bent over and smushed and all that. She can still walk around fairly normally and doesn't really have a lot of pain in her feet, and they are not as small as they need to be. And so she is seen as a failure in this light. So because of that, he starts training her even harder to make up for this failure, to be more beautiful and more graceful. So instead, he focuses on training her to be a maid rather than a concubine, so that she can still at least work in the palace and eventually possibly gain more favor and status from there. So he also then, the day comes when he's going to sell her off to the palace, and he dresses her up really pretty and puts all these cosmetics on her and everything. And I just want y'all to remember that she is still a child at this point. She's maybe I think 9 or 10, something like that. And she's sold off to the palace. And the ladies come to collect her, to buy her for the palace, and to determine where she's going to be put. And when girls are brought into the palace, their status is determined by how beautiful they are and also what skills they possess. And the fact of the matter is that Li doesn't really have a lot of very feminine skills. She doesn't display having really great singing. She doesn't display having really great poetry. She doesn't display having really great dancing and just, other graceful feminine qualities, because she spent her childhood basically railing against all of this stuff, just running around and being a tomboy. And these women see right through all of the pretty clothes and the makeup and everything, and they realize she's really not that pretty. And let's just back it up. She is pretty. It's just that beauty back then was just outrageous, the standards for being in the palace and for having the very high positions. You had to be outrageously supermodel level beauty to hold a lot of those higher positions as a woman. So you could still be pretty, but have a lower position, because it's okay, yeah, you're pretty, everyone else here. Being pretty was a requirement of working in the palace. How pretty you were, combined with how talented you were, determined what status. So being pretty, really didn't matter. And they realized she really wasn't fit for being in the palace. They're okay, her feet are not bound like you promised. She's not all that pretty. She's wild. She's not very talented. We have a place for her, but it's not great. And at this point, the father just wants to get rid of her, and very specifically does not want these ladies to find out that his daughter is a fox spirit before he can offload her and have her no longer be his problem. And that's pretty much what she's become at this point, is just a problem that he needs to get rid of. Not even, okay, we want all this status, it's make her go away and still get at least something out of it after all the time and effort that they spent on her. And so she is sent to the area of the palace where they raise the silkworms for making the silk. And this is perfect for Li. She's able to run around and run amok and be outside and play with other kids her age all day, every day. Now, I don't want to discount that this is very hard work that she has to do, especially as a child. But at the very least, she does not have to do all the things that her father and his wife and the concubines were all trying to force on her all day, every day with. And so she learns a lot about what it is to work and to kind of have a place in society and all that. And she really enjoys being with the other girls that work in this silk farm. And she learns that they are unfortunately very beneath her, that these are girls that were raised by farmers. These are girls that were not raised to be pretty, to be smart, to be talented. They were raised to be labor. And a lot of them also have deformities. And when I say deformities, like, I mean, like, not like lotus feet, like they're born with a club foot, or they're born with, you know, not enough fingers, or their face is deformed, or, you know, stuff like that. It's basically stuff that makes them not fit to work at the palace. So that's why they're delegated to this hard labor, essentially, of working in the mulberry grove forest and feeding all of these silkworms and taking care of these trees to make sure that the silkworms flourish. And it soon becomes apparent that even though Li is wild, that she is just so much better than this position. So she gets a little bit older and they upgrade her to being one of the people who spins the silk. And this is actually a really good job, and this is something that women in Chinese society were able to utilize the same way as women in Western society with spinning thread, aka wool, in that you could become an independent person earning your own money and you didn't have to depend on a man to make your own living. That's where the word spinster comes from. Women who spin thread, because it is one of the few positions that you can hold and make your own money and not have to marry. That's where the word spinster comes from and why it has a negative connotation, because how dare women be independent to make their own living and not have to marry, boo, and all of that. So, fun fact for y'all. And she becomes pretty good at it. But the other spinsters don't like her and want to push her out because she's pretty. So that kind of comes back to this whole thing. If she's not outrageously pretty, but she's pretty. And this is where her fox spirit stuff starts to come through, is they start accusing her of being too seductive and using her wiles to get her positions and to move up in the world, because that is a big thing in Chinese society, is they don't like it when people move up in the world. That's seen as, oh, you are threatening my position, you are competition now, you're after me. And so, you know, when someone moves up, it's seen as a very negative thing for the other people in that position. So they, as the newcomer and as being pretty, they did not like her. And so when she was still behaving all foxy and whatever, they were like, oh, we're going to latch onto this and all that and push her out. The other thing about this is that it's important that Li didn't do this work being a spinner for too long. It ruins your hands. That's also where that idea of like the old crone with the knobby, horrible, gross hands comes from, is that's what happens to spinsters, is the act of spinning the wool and or the silk thread, or, you know, whatever fabric thread, it ruins your hands and actually makes them look like that. Probably not so dramatically, but it makes your hands like not aesthetically pleasing anymore. And so in order to be able to move up from being a spinster, she needed to preserve her hands. And so she eventually does move up through the system. And so beyond this, I don't want to spoil the story for y'all, because this is where the story really starts to take a turn with that Li does the eye of a man, and people around her believe that she is using her fox spirity wiles to use witchcraft and seduce him and whatever, so they have to overcome that. But he is a man of high position, and he essentially helps her to continue growing her position and moving up in the world and gaining more success. And people don't like that, obviously, and are constantly seeing ways to try to harm her. The other problem is that the man that she ends up gaining favor with, and honestly eventually falls in love with, is not completely Chinese. He is what's called Eurasian, where he is the child of a Chinese person and an Asian person. And unfortunately, back then, the Chinese were very xenophobic and saw people of mixed ethnicity as a bad thing. So that was another strike against them with these challenges that they had to face. And eventually things happen. Again, I don't want to spoil the story because it is excellent. And the story falls to Li's daughter. And again, I'm going to put her name down here because I don't really know how to pronounce it and I don't want to mispronounce it, but the meaning is Little Star, which I think is so adorable. Her name is Little Star and I love it. But yeah, so then the story continues with Little Star and she kind of picks up her mother's mantle and continues on with her mother's goals. And what's very interesting about this is that the main challenge that Little Star faces is that this is on the cusp of World War II and there is a lot of political conflict going on during this time, and she actually ends up going up into the mountains with other refugees, and that's where her story starts. So there's just so much incredible drama. There's so many historical tidbits in this story. And the fact that, you know, we also get to see this like passing on of the torch from mother to daughter and then seeing the daughter pick up that torch and continue on with the story is also an aspect that I really enjoyed about this story. And I can't get too much more specific than that because it'll ruin it for you, honestly. There are just so many big twists and turns that this book takes that telling you about it would completely spoil it and ruin the surprise for y'all. But The Concubines Daughter is such a great book. I learned so much about Chinese culture and history reading this book, and I highly recommend it. It is definitely the main characters, both the mother and the daughter, are strong female leads and just everything that you can ask for in a very exciting story. So I hope y'all enjoyed this video. If you did, please be sure to give it a like, and if you're new, subscribe. All right, y'all, thank you so much for watching. Take care. Bye-bye.